It is the morning of June 1st, 1921. You are standing on Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And what you are looking at does not match a single thing you were ever taught about Black America in 1921. There is a hotel in front of you, a real one. 6 stories tall, with an elevator. There is a law office next door, a dentist upstairs, a theater down the street showing first-run films. There are grocery stores, pharmacies, jewelry stores, and a hospital. Black doctors treating black patients with equipment that most white hospitals in the country did not yet have. Black lawyers arguing cases. Black accountants managing books. Black entrepreneurs running businesses that employ hundreds of people. Black families living in homes they own. Black children walking to schools they built. Booker T. Washington visited this place and called it, and this is a direct quote, the most remarkable black community in the entire United States. You are standing in the Greenwood district, the place the world would come to call Black Wall Street, and in less than 16 hours, every single thing you can see from where you are standing will be ash. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. This is not a story about what was taken from Black Americans. It is a story about what Black Americans built, and then what America did to it when it got too big, too successful, and too impossible to ignore. Stay with me, because this part matters. To understand what Greenwood was, you have to understand what it was built inside of. Oklahoma in 1921 was barely a state. It had only received statehood in 1907, 14 years old, and in those 14 years it had developed one of the most aggressively segregated social structures in the American South. The law kept black and white Americans separated in almost every public space. Schools, restaurants, hospitals, waiting rooms, telephone booths. The law told Black Americans where they could live, where they could work, and what they were allowed to want. And inside those laws, inside those walls, inside every restriction and humiliation designed to keep Black Americans economically dependent and politically invisible, a group of people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, built something that should not have been possible. They built it anyway. The story begins with one man and one decision. His name was O.W. Gurley. Gurley arrived in Tulsa in 1906, 1 year before Oklahoma even became a state. He was a graduate of Atlanta University. He had money in his pocket and a plan in his head. He bought 40 acres of land north of the railroad tracks. The tracks that, in virtually every southern city of that era, served as the literal physical line between the black section of town and the white section of town. He built a rooming house on that land, then a grocery store. Then he started selling lots, exclusively to black buyers. Not because the law required it, because he understood something that almost nobody around him had yet figured out. If Black Americans were going to be excluded from white economic systems, from white banks that would not lend to them, white businesses that would not hire them, white neighborhoods they were legally barred from entering, then the answer was not to beg for inclusion in those systems. The answer was to build better ones. And what came next was something nobody, not even Gurley, could have fully anticipated. Within a few years, other people with the same idea started arriving. J.B. Stratford built the Stratford Hotel, 68 rooms, the largest black-owned hotel in the United States at the time. He had a philosophy, one he was not subtle about, that every black dollar spent in a black business stayed in the community and grew there instead of leaving. He made it policy. He made it pride. John and Lula Williams built a confectionery, then a rooming house, then the Dreamland Theater, a 1,000-seat movie theater on Greenwood Avenue that showed films, hosted live performances, and became one of the beating social hearts of the community. J. Smitherman founded the Tulsa Star newspaper, and he used it to say things that black newspapers in that era rarely said in print. He called out injustice directly. He named it. He argued, plainly in ink, that black Americans had the right to defend themselves against violence. In 1921 Oklahoma, putting those words in print was not journalism. It was an act of courage. 1921, the Greenwood district had 35 blocks of black-owned businesses. Over 30 restaurants, grocery stores, law offices, a hospital, 2 movie theaters, hotels, billiard halls, barbershops, beauty salons, 13 churches, 2 schools, a public library, a bus system, insurance companies, a law school, and banks, actual banks, that gave black entrepreneurs the loans that white banks denied them. Here is the number that defines what Greenwood actually was. The dollar circulated inside Greenwood 19 times before it ever left the community. In white Tulsa? This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was the result of a specific, deliberate, generational decision to build an economy so complete and so self-sustaining that it did not need white approval, white access, or white investment to function. They had been told they could not participate in the American economy on equal terms. So they built their own economy on better terms, and it worked. That is the thing that history tends to glide past, almost as if it makes people uncomfortable. It worked. Beautifully. For nearly 2 decades. It worked. Black families in Greenwood owned their homes at higher rates than black families in most other American cities. They educated their children at higher rates. And here's the detail that stops people cold when they hear it. The Greenwood district had a literacy rate that exceeded the national average for white Americans in 1921. They had built, inside the walls of American segregation, something that looked an awful lot like proof. Proof that those walls were never about protecting white Americans from something dangerous. They were about protecting white Americans from something threatening. And the difference between dangerous and threatening is everything. Dangerous means it might hurt you. Threatening means it might prove you wrong. But the real story, the part that history buried for 80 years, begins here. The events that destroyed Greenwood began with a moment that lasted less than 60 seconds. On the afternoon of May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator in a downtown Tulsa office building. The elevator was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator is not known with certainty. It has never been known with certainty. The most credible reconstruction, based on physical evidence and accounts of people who knew both of them, is this. Rowland stumbled. He grabbed the elevator door or the operator's arm to steady himself. Page screamed. Someone in the building heard it and called the police. That's it. That is the whole thing. The following morning, the Tulsa Tribune ran a story. That was enough. Had begun gathering outside, growing, feeding on the story, feeding on the headline, feeding on something much older and much uglier than anything that had happened in that elevator. The sheriff barricaded the courthouse. He told his deputies to let no one in, to protect the prisoner at all costs, because he knew, as clearly as he knew anything, what a white mob in Tulsa in 1921 would do to a black man accused of touching a white woman. But here is the part of this story that gets left out of almost every telling. The black men of Greenwood did not hide. They did not wait. They did not hope the sheriff would handle it. A group of them, armed, organized, and fully aware of what was at stake, got in their cars and drove to the courthouse. They offered to help guard the prisoner. The sheriff told them to go home, that he had it under control, that their presence would only make things worse. They left, and then they came back, because the white mob outside the courthouse had grown to over 1,000 people, and some of them were visibly armed. A small group of black men, somewhere between 25 and 75, depending on the account, stood outside the courthouse, armed, in public, making clear that Dick Rowland was not going to be taken from that jail without a fight. A white man approached one of the black veterans and told him to hand over his pistol. He refused. A shot was fired. To this day, nobody knows who fired it. It did not matter. What mattered was what came next. The white mob that had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse turned and moved north toward Greenwood. What followed through the night of May 31st and into the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, was not a riot in the way that word usually gets used. A riot implies chaos. It implies both sides engaged in equal and mutual destruction. What happened in Tulsa was not that. What happened in Tulsa was an invasion. Armed white men moved through the streets of Greenwood shooting residents. Black men returning fire from their homes and businesses were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. White men broke into buildings and set them alight. Fire trucks that responded to the fires in Greenwood were turned back by the mob. And now I need you to picture something specific. Picture a family, a mother, a father, children, young ones old enough to be frightened. They are inside a house they own on a street they have lived on for years. They built this house. They know every neighbor on this block. Their children go to school 2 blocks away. And now there is fire on both sides of them, and men with guns in the street, and they have nowhere to go. That is not an abstraction. That is what 10,000 people experienced in the same hours of the same night. The Tulsa Police Department did not stop it. Members of the Tulsa Police Department participated in it. Officers arrested black residents who were fleeing the fires. Some of them, according to eyewitness testimony documented in the official state investigation 80 years later, shot at black residents themselves. The Oklahoma National Guard arrived. They did not stop the invasion. They detained black Tulsans. They marched thousands of black residents at gunpoint to internment centers, the convention hall and the fairgrounds, where they were held under armed guard. Over 6,000 black people were detained by the National Guard in their own city, while their homes burned. Now I need you to stay with me for this next part, because what I'm about to tell you is something the official record spent decades trying to avoid confirming. Then there were the planes. Tulsa, in 1921, had a small private airfield. And on the morning of June 1st, 1921, private planes appeared over the Greenwood district. Multiple eyewitnesses, interviewed in the years and decades after the massacre, reported seeing gunfire coming from those planes. Some reported seeing incendiary devices dropped from them. The official investigations have never been able to confirm or definitively rule out the aerial attack. But the eyewitness accounts from dozens of survivors are consistent and specific. This was not a spontaneous mob getting out of hand. This was organized. This was coordinated. This had planes. By the time it was over, 35 blocks of the Greenwood district had been burned to the ground. Between 1,250 and 1,500 homes. Destroyed. Every single business on Greenwood Avenue. Gone. Both movie theaters. The Stratford Hotel. The law offices. The doctor's offices. The hospital. The schools. The library. The churches. Gone. The official death toll set by the state was 39, 36 black, 3 white. But the investigators who examined this event decades later, who looked at burial records and hospital records and eyewitness accounts, believe the true number is likely somewhere between 100 and 300 people dead, possibly more. Many of the dead were buried in mass graves that have never been officially located. And Dick Rowland, the young man the mob said they came for, he was released. The charges were dropped. Sarah Page declined to press charges. She may have done so from the very beginning. Some accounts suggest the charges were never fully formalized in the first place. The thing that ended Black Wall Street was not what happened in that elevator. Whatever happened in that elevator was over in 60 seconds and harmed no one permanently. The thing that ended Black Wall Street was what 1,000 white men decided to do with a newspaper headline and an old, festering resentment of black success in a city where black people were supposed to stay poor and stay quiet. Now comes the part of this story that is, in some ways, more painful than the fire itself. Not a single person was ever prosecuted for the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Not one. The grand jury that convened in the weeks following the massacre assigned blame for the violence to, and this is the actual documented conclusion of the actual grand jury, the black residents of Greenwood. The men who had gone to the courthouse to protect a prisoner from a lynch mob. Those men. That was the official conclusion, but it gets worse. The city of Tulsa moved quickly to pass ordinances making it illegal to rebuild in the Greenwood district using the same materials as before. Fire-resistant materials would now be required for any new construction in the area. It sounds like a safety regulation. It was not a safety regulation, it was a demolition strategy. The new requirements made rebuilding financially impossible for families who had just lost everything they owned. The plan, documented in city council records, was to use the cleared land for an industrial zone, to make sure that what had been burned stayed burned. And here is where this story refuses to be only a story about destruction. The black residents of Greenwood went to court. They won injunctions blocking the new ordinances, and then they did something that still feels almost impossible to fully absorb. They went back. Within weeks of the massacre, residents who had nowhere to sleep, no businesses, no resources, began rebuilding, in tents, in the ruins. Through a Tulsa summer, then a Tulsa winter, they rebuilt, without city support, without state support, without federal support, without a single dollar of reparation or reconstruction aid from any government body. By the mid-1920s, Greenwood had risen again, not to what it had been, never quite to what it had been, but it rose. It rebuilt. It continued. The businesses came back, the churches came back, the schools came back. Greenwood Avenue became a commercial street again. They rebuilt it, from ash, with their bare hands, and no help. And then, over the following decades, a different kind of destruction arrived. One that did not come with planes and guns. One that came with policy documents and highway maps. Urban renewal programs in the 1950s and 1960s. Federal programs, officially neutral, officially race-blind, carved Interstate 244 directly through the Greenwood district. The highway destroyed what the fire had not finished. The properties that had been rebuilt. The community that had reassembled itself from nothing. The buildings where people raised children who had been raised in the buildings before them. Condemned, cleared, to make way for a road. Think about what that means in human terms. The survivors of the massacre. People who as children watched their world burn, who spent years rebuilding it with their own hands, grew old in those rebuilt homes, raised families, watched grandchildren be born, and then the government came again. Not with fire this time, with paperwork, and said, "This belongs to us now." This time there were no injunctions that stopped it. For most of the 20th century, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not in Oklahoma history textbooks, not because it was controversial, because it simply did not exist in the official record. Teachers who had lived through it, who had been children in Tulsa in 1921, did not teach it. Survivors who had watched their homes and businesses burn did not speak publicly about it. The massacre was buried. Not in the way that shameful things are buried while everyone privately knows the truth. In the way that a fact can be made to not exist by the collective decision of enough powerful people to never repeat it. Survivors, interviewed in the 1990s and early 2000s when the state of Oklahoma finally commissioned an official investigation, described being told as children not to talk about it. Not by parents trying to protect them from pain. By a community that had learned that talking about it brought more trouble than silence. The official state investigation was commissioned in 1997. The report was released in 2001. It confirmed what the survivors had always known. It confirmed the death toll discrepancy, the role of law enforcement in the attack, the aerial involvement, the fact that the destruction of Greenwood was deliberate, organized, and participated in by agents of the state. It recommended reparations. The Oklahoma legislature declined to pay them. In 2020, nearly 100 years after the massacre, the last known survivors of the Tulsa race massacre testified before the United States Congress. There were 3 of them. The youngest was 101 years old. She had been a child in Greenwood on the night of May 31st, 1921. She had watched the fire from outside the city where her family had fled. She had gone back the next morning and seen what was left. 101 years old, sitting before the United States Congress, asking them to make it right. Congress has not yet passed reparations legislation for the Tulsa race massacre. Here is what needs to be said plainly before this story ends. Black Wall Street was not destroyed because of what happened in an elevator. It was not destroyed because of Dick Rowland or Sarah Page or whatever 60-second interaction took place between them on the afternoon of May 30th, 1921. Black Wall Street was destroyed because it existed, because a self-sufficient, thriving, economically powerful black community in the middle of a segregated American city was not, to a specific group of white Tulsans, an inspiration, not proof of what was possible, not something to admire or learn from or leave alone. It was a problem. And here is what kind of problem it was. It was proof that the story told about black Americans, that they were incapable of self-governance, incapable of economic sophistication, incapable of building and sustaining complex institutions, was a lie. Not an oversimplification, not an incomplete picture. A lie. And Greenwood was the evidence. You cannot maintain a story about a group of people's inferiority while that group of people is running a hospital, operating a law school, and circulating $19 times inside their own economy. You cannot keep telling that story in the same breath as facts that directly contradict it. So the facts were removed, the community was removed, and then the story about why it was removed was also removed. For 80 years. What happened in Tulsa on June 1st, 1921, was not unique in American history. It was one of dozens of similar attacks on prosperous black communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Rosewood, Florida in 1923. Elaine, Arkansas in 1919. Atlanta in 1906. East St. Louis in 1917. The pattern was consistent enough to have a name. Historians call them race riots, but that name does the same thing that calling the attack on Greenwood a riot does. It implies mutual participation. It implies both sides equally. What the pattern actually shows is this: when black Americans built something successful enough, visible enough, and economically threatening enough to provoke white resentment, the resentment was not expressed through competition. It was not expressed through building something better. It was expressed through fire, through organized violence, through the deliberate dismantling of what had been built, and through the deliberate forgetting of what had been destroyed. O.W. Gurley, the man who bought 40 acres north of the railroad tracks in 1906 and started building, left Tulsa after the massacre. He moved to California. He rebuilt his life. He never returned to Greenwood. J.B. Stratford, whose 68-room hotel was one of the first buildings burned, was charged with inciting a riot for organizing resistance to the mob. He fled to Chicago before he could be arrested. The charges against him were officially cleared by the state of Oklahoma in 1996, 75 years later, long after he was dead. A J. Smitherman, the newspaper editor who had spent years writing about the right of black Americans to defend themselves, fled to Springfield, Massachusetts. He started another newspaper. He kept writing. The Dreamland Theater, John and Lula Williams' 1,000-seat movie house, burned on the night of June 1st, 1921. The Williams family rebuilt it in 1922. It operated until the 1970s, when the highway programs that cut through Greenwood ended what the fire had not. Dick Rowland left Tulsa shortly after his release and was never heard from publicly again. Nobody knows where he went. Nobody knows what happened to him. Sarah Page left Tulsa sometime after the massacre. Nobody knows where she went either. What Black Wall Street actually was at its peak is worth saying one more time clearly. It was not a symbol. It was not a metaphor. It was not an idea. It was a fully functioning, economically sophisticated, self-sustaining community built by people who had every structural reason not to be able to build it, who had been legally excluded from the resources that American society said you needed to build something like that, who had been told, directly and in writing and in law, that they were not capable of what they were in the process of demonstrating they were absolutely capable of. And they built it anyway. And then it was taken from them in 16 hours, and then it was forgotten for 80 years. And then, when it was finally remembered, when the survivors finally testified before Congress at 101 years old, the people who burned it down, or whose grandfathers burned it down, or whose city government authorized the burning and then spent decades pretending it had not happened. They were asked what they would do to make it right, and most of them said nothing, and the question is still waiting for an answer. There is a stretch of Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma today. There are murals on the walls showing what it looked like in 1921. There is a museum. There are markers with the names of the businesses that stood there and the people who built them. So there are tourists who come to look at those markers and read about what was there and the community that built it, the descendants of the people who built and rebuilt and were displaced twice. Many of them are still in Tulsa, still there, still waiting. Here is the question that this story leaves behind. When you build something, with your hands, with your money, with your vision, with your sacrifice, and it is taken from you by force, and no one is ever held accountable, and the taking is hidden for generations, and then acknowledged but not repaired. What do you call that? America has several answers to that question, depending on who is asking. The people of